People often ask if Mormonism is a Christian religion, and I like the response of my emerita colleague Jan Ships here at IUPUI, who says that Mormonism is Christianity plus.
It's an interesting sort of discussion point because if you think back historically, we were a people who were set apart from the culture of America, if you will, physically. I mean, we literally, the members of the church got up and walked out and went to Utah and started their own culture there. And it's really come full circle to the point where now a member of the church, as being a member of the church, whether it's here or really anywhere in the United States and Canada, is really a matter of looking at, are we really different and in what ways?
Mormonism's founder, Joseph Smith, talked about restoring the true church, and people often wonder what he meant by that. Mormonism is, to its followers, a restoration first and foremost. It restores something that was lost, and in this case, Joseph Smith meant the restoration of the authentic teachings and practices instituted by Jesus Christ, but that were lost in part because some of these teachings and practices were recorded on the specifically Latter-day Saint portion of the Scriptures, the Book of Mormon and other Mormon writings, that were then restored to the world, according to Mormon belief, when Joseph Smith discovered the plates containing the Book of Mormon and recorded other revelations given to him that became part of the larger body of Mormon scripture. And so all of that together is thought of as the Mormon restoration, the restoration of the true beliefs and practices that Christians were meant all along to follow and believe.
There's often a question about why we're so interested both in our own history as a people and in our personal family history. And I think one of the significant issues as a people is that our history is important to us because it reminds us of how significant events that have taken place in your history have formed you as a people.
Another question about Mormonism that people ask often is, where does the term Mormonism come from? And it's derived from the Book of Mormon itself. Mormon was a character in the Book of Mormon, the last of the military leaders of the Nephites. The Nephites are the like the protagonist, the central tribe focused on in the Book of Mormon. So Mormon, this Nephite leader, recorded his experiences, and his account was finished by his son Moroni, who then ultimately buried the record in the form of the gold plates, and then centuries later reappeared in angelic form to Joseph Smith.
The history led to violence by people who would develop these hard feelings. And Joseph Smith, for example, was on a Saturday night pulled from his home and tarred and feathered, and his children, were sick because it's in the middle of winter. And the next day, everyone shows up to find out how is he going to react to all of this. And his reaction was to stand up on Sunday morning after being up all night Saturday night trying to have all of this tar and all these feathers pulled from him, and to preach a sermon about what it means to love one another. And that, I think, affects personally our ability to say, persecution happens. We can't insulate ourselves from that, but we can react to it in a way that is not just defensive, but also recognizes.
Mormonism has been controversial in American history from its beginnings, but the reason for the controversy has changed over time. In the beginnings of Mormon tradition, the controversy was primarily over plural marriage, the practice of men taking more wives than one. And this was first revealed to Joseph Smith, the prophet and founder, and then after his murder, polygamy or plural marriage was continued under his successor Brigham Young, who took the practice to Utah and began a long-running battle with federal authorities over the practice of plural marriage in that part of what is today the United States. The cartoon is a wonderful example of anti-Mormon sentiment in the 19th century in the U.S. It depicts Brigham Young, who was the successor to Joseph Smith as president and prophet of the church, in bed with some of his plural wives. It's said that Brigham Young had over 50 plural wives and more than 50 children by those wives. Of course, Joseph Smith and Brigham Young believed that God had commanded the practice of polygamy. The Bible presupposes the practice of polygamy. Nevertheless, that practice was at odds with the prevailing American mores, and it put the church in conflict with American culture, sometimes violent conflict. It became clear, in fact, that the territory of Utah would never attain statehood until the church gave up the practice of plural marriage. And so in 1890 that happened when the president of the church, Wilford Woodruff, issued what later was called the Manifesto disavowing polygamy. Though the real end of polygamy didn't happen overnight, there were holdouts even high up in the church hierarchy for a couple of decades. By the first decade, the 20th century, the practice was coming to an end, and what brought it to a head and to a final end was the controversy over the seating of Utah Senator Reed Smoot, who was a Mormon apostle, a top leader of the church. Many of his colleagues in the Senate felt that Smoot was not fit to be a senator because he had this position within the church, and a series of hearings ensued. Smoot was ultimately seated in the Senate in 1907, and in the following year the church placed Wilford Woodruff's disavowal of polygamy, the so-called Manifesto, into Mormon sacred scripture by adding it to the Doctrine and Covenants. A couple of Mormon apostles who had practiced plural marriage after 1890 resigned their positions, and that made clear to other Americans that the church was really giving up the practice of plural marriage. and it paved the way for the mainstreaming of Mormonism in American culture.
Even though it's not been part of our doctrine for better than 100 years, we still get the questions, and so we have to be prepared to answer those in a way that people will understand. And so not only just explaining the fact that it's not part of our doctrine anymore, but also to not be defensive about that. The same thing happens with respect to other unique aspects of our faith. So for example, I'm often asked about the fact that we don't drink alcohol in our church. And the response that I have taken in my life personally is to embrace that. And so I'm not defensive about it. And if I go to a cocktail party, instead of pretending that perhaps I have a drink of some kind in my hand, I order milk. There is no question that I'm not drinking alcohol, and I can have a conversation with people about the fact that, yeah, that is a unique aspect of our health code that we try to live, that we think is going to help us be healthy and strong and be able to do the kind of things physically and spiritually that God asks of us.
There are two main institutional manifestations of Mormonism in the United States today. The one that's most familiar to people is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as it's officially known. That's what most people think of as the Mormon Church. That's the Utah-based church, and the church that under Brigham Young first settled there in the Great Basin in Utah. That church is the fourth largest, according to some recent estimates, the fourth largest denomination in the United States today, after the Catholic Church, the Southern Baptist Convention, and the United Methodist Church. That in itself says something about the mainstreaming of Mormonism and the phenomenal growth of Mormonism over the course of the 20th and now 21st centuries. The other institutional manifestation of Mormonism is what's officially known as the Community of Christ, formerly called the Reorganized Church of Latter-day Saints. And that is a smaller group, but a historically important one that remained in Independence, Missouri, when the larger group of Latter-day Saints moved westward to Utah. That church has its own history, but it's part of the broader Mormon tradition that includes the Utah church. And so when we refer to Mormons, we need to remember that we're referring both to Utah Mormons and to those who are now part of the Community of Christ. But today, because of the growth of the LDS Church, this city has been identified as the site of a new temple, and I think that is a metaphor for Mormonism's coming into the mainstream of the U.S. religious landscape in a real way.
We are very excited to be having a temple built in Indianapolis. There are now somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 or more temples around the world. There was a time in the church when the saints arrived in the Salt Lake Valley and they began building the Salt Lake Temple. Whether there was a thought that there would only be one temple that was built and restored, if you will, to the earth, it became very clear very quickly with the growth of the church that there were some, I think, important spiritual consequences of temple worship and temple worship being restored to the earth. That temple in Salt Lake took 40 years to build. There's something biblical about that as well, but the building of that temple also was a reminder to us, I think, as we look back now and have the benefit of hindsight, to look at that and say, there was a time when the people of Israel wandered the desert and they carried that tabernacle with them. They had the temple, if you will, as a traveling reminder of their responsibility for temple worship. And then when the church, when the Latter-day Saint Church found itself located someplace, they weren't wandering anymore. a temple was built. I can look back now and see what has happened over the course of time since the Salt Lake Temple was built, and see that this is now a restoration sort of in reverse, where now the Lord has said to his living prophets, the temple should be close to the people. And so now we have the opportunity where not everybody travels to Salt Lake City to worship in the temple, but rather those temples are being built in places where the saints have gathered in various parts of the world, including Indianapolis, Indiana. And so it's a tremendous opportunity for us. I think it's our ability to look at what has happened over the course of the history of the church in Indiana, and to have seen that the church has grown to near 50,000 members in Indiana, and be able to look at that and say, that is an important reminder to us that our responsibility that the Lord has given to us to take the restoration of the gospel to the four corners of the earth includes right here in Indianapolis, Indiana, and the Lord's recognition that not that we deserve a temple, because it's not a reward for the things that have been done, but that we're prepared for a temple. And the worship and the work that's required of us to have a temple is something that we're prepared to take on as a people. So it's an exciting reminder to us that the work continues to move forward.